All right, welcome everyone. My name is Professor Dustin Schwent. I'm one of the film media arts professors at the University of Utah Asia campus. So today I want to talk to you about the history of film festivals. So when people think of film festivals, they usually think of two things that come to mind. One is the glamour of the big premiere film festivals like Busan International Film Festival, or the independent style film festival like Sundance over in Utah. But what a lot of people don't think about is that there's actually one of the roots of film festivals came out of fascism. So when we look at the concept of fascism, is defined as a political philosophy or movement or regime that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. So this really runs counter to what we think of in terms of the independent film festival. So I'll get back to kind of where that root comes from. But first off, when we think of media in general, usually whoever is controlling the media has the power in society in some ways. And we've seen this in different incarnations throughout history. So for example, early on, when the printing press came out, Martin Luther showed up and he had his 95 Theses that he went against the Catholic Church with, and there was a big revolution in Europe called the Protestant Reformation, and this caused a lot of upheaval and transformation throughout Europe during that time. And a lot of it came out of the printing press. Suddenly people had access to a text that normally they would have to go through the priest for, okay? So they were able to have direct access to information. And this evolved into newspapers. And so eventually newspapers started being printed more and more, and especially when you had from like throughout like 1700s, 1800s, newspapers were there, but around 1830 or so, the newspapers became really widespread in terms of everyone had access to them in some ways. And so those who had control of the newspaper industry often had control of the politics and sometimes foreign policy and other issues. So William Randolph Hearst is someone that was a big, what we call like a magnate, someone who has control of a lot of publications. And he had his own politics. And so often through his newspapers, he would drive political thought. And one famous example is when he helped to provoke the US into a war with Spain. And there was a ship that got blown up in the Havana Harbor. And some people wonder, like, was this a real event, or was it something manufactured, or was it manipulated in some ways? But in any event, William Randolph Hearst, his newspapers was really pushing a lot of pro-war sentiment at the time, and it allowed him to sell a lot of newspapers. And there's a famous quote where people say he said, you provide, basically, if you provide the situation, I'll provide the war. Like, okay, so he's saying, I'll provide the war through my newspaper. All right. So when radio showed up, again, those who were able to sort of take control of that medium were able to have power. There's actually a novel called All the Light We Cannot See that has this quote at the beginning where it talks about Germany's power with the radio and how it really directly related to them taking power in Europe at the time. So around 1920s, the radio shows up as a popular form of communication and entertainment. We start to see these box radios in American homes in particular, but also throughout the world. And first it's seen as kind of an entertainment medium, but eventually you start to see it being used for politics. So on the bottom right here is an image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he famously, through the 1930s Depression, he would have his what they called fireside chats, where he would talk to the people about the economic situation and encourage them in some ways. And so some people like my grandparents would look back on that time with a fond memory, but also radio was used to drive political thought towards countries entering a war. And so Hitler, Churchill, and Roosevelt, all three were using the radio to kind of message their people into getting involved in this conflict in Europe. Okay. So Hitler used it to really influence the minds of the German people, and Churchill and Roosevelt on the opposite side were really motivating the citizens to fight against this Nazi power that was in Europe. Okay, but radio was definitely the central force in all of this. So television, when that came around 1950s, so radio was still there. And this moment that you see on the upper right here of these two men, radio and television really affect this in some ways, because this was the 1960 American election, and you had John F. Kennedy running, he's on the left, and then you had Richard Nixon on the right here. And it was interesting because people that were listening to this debate on the radio, some of them thought that it was a tie or that Nixon did better because they were listening to what he was saying and maybe even how he was saying it. And in the case of Kennedy, the people that watched the television, there was a real tilt towards them thinking he won the debate because he just looked better on television. Some of that was just his physical look. Also, there were things Kennedy did for television, like wear makeup and do some stuff to make sure he didn't look too uncomfortable. But Nixon famously was sweating a lot and wiping his lip, and so people saw that he was maybe not as ready for the job in some ways. And so this idea of the television president and the person who's really, you know, has the right image for the job became a bigger deal in American politics. And this is true throughout the world. Once we have like visual mediums, we start to look at our leaders not just as what they say or how they say it, but also how they look as a leader. Okay. And of course, when the internet shows up, this also affects politics quite a bit. And so early 2000s, up to that point, television was really the thing. That's what mattered for running for office. But eventually when the internet shows up, there starts to be other ways to take power. And so one way was that, for example, Barack Obama in 2007 and 8, he used the internet to raise money for his campaign. He would send emails out every few days to his supporters to send in a little bit of money here and there. And so he was able to raise a lot of money that way. But also people sharing things on Facebook. And this 2007, Facebook was getting big at that point. But a lot of that campaign was email. But then by 2012, we had multiple platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And suddenly we saw that that was a big force in that election as well. And of course, Donald Trump, when he ran for president, a lot of his campaign came out of his Twitter account. And so he was able to get a huge amount of followers because of his television fame before that. And throughout his presidency, a lot of the news was running based on what Donald Trump would be tweeting. And it's interesting because now that his Twitter account's been closed, it's been a lot quieter about the things he's saying. So you can see the direct relationship between power and media there. So the question is like, where do these media forms go, you know, from here? Because usually any of the whatever new media we have in the future, whatever person is able to master that is often going to be someone that has power in some ways. Hello? I think mute them. Sorry. Okay. All right. So what about film? How does this relate to film? Okay. So if you guys study film history here, you'll learn a lot about this sort of trajectory of film history. So film shows up as a medium around 1870 when Muybridge did his motion test, where he would they basically took multiple photographs of a horse running and were able to put it together and create the first early strips of film from that. Okay. And then once film was developed as a thing that you can run through the camera with these, you know, multiple images being exposed to the camera, we started to see film used as both entertainment and documentary. So you can see here in that second image, this is an example of one of the Edison films where people would watch these little short, almost like YouTube clips in the early days. People would watch these short films in this box and they would just film people doing entertainment actions. And then on the upper right, you can see kind of a mix of a documentary style, but also this piece isn't moving, but it's also kind of a comedy piece. And these are the Lumiere brothers who took a camera outside and started to film media that way. And eventually this developed into narrative storytelling, where you have a film, The Trip to the Moon by George Méliès, and then A Great Train Robbery coming within a year of each other, where they started to tell actual stories through cinema. Eventually, D.W. Griffith shows up with his film Intolerance, and Intolerance was a huge moment in cinema because it was a really epic film. It actually came after another more notorious big film called The Birth of a Nation. But with Intolerance, the reason this film is important is that this was the film that ended up finding its way over to Russia. And over in Russia, there were filmmakers who were studying the art, and they started to figure out ways to re-edit this film and put things together in different ways to create new meanings. And so that culminated in a film called Battleship Potemkin that you see on the bottom right here. Came out in 1924. And this really showed like the power of cinema, the power of editing in order to move people towards a message and to use it for propaganda purposes. Okay. So part of that, what caused this to happen was the development of the Moscow Film School. So the Soviet Union formed in 1917 with the revolution there. And part of that movement, they wanted a way to communicate to the masses, and they had people in their country that had multiple languages, so they needed to communicate visually. And so they developed a film school in order to express this, find ways to communicate to people through image. And that's where they did a lot of the studies of breaking film apart, re-editing it, figuring out how to get that message across more effectively. And so on the bottom right, you can see Eisenstein here. He's the one that made that last film, Potemkin. And he's looking at, you know, which shots to cut and where to put them together, okay? Because editing was a big part of this. So meanwhile, in France, there were these cineclubs or film societies, and they would just be watching the work that was coming out of the US and Europe. And so here you have an example of a documentary called Nanook of the North that they were watching. And also French filmmakers started to create their own avant-garde cinema, like experimental films. And so they were joining together to watch these. So you might have people gathering in a cafe, or you might have them going to a movie theater, or they might watch in a cinema theater and then come and meet and discuss the films. And so there was a real dialogue going on about cinema. This is kind of the precursor to the festival culture we have now. Okay, but there weren't any actual festivals happening per se. So in 1922, Mussolini takes power in Italy, and he was also quite interested in what cinema could do in terms of a force for communication. So radio was there. You can see him talking with microphones here, but he was really interested in the potential of cinema for communication as well. And so he went to work really establishing, kind of modeling it after what the Soviet Union did with putting together a whole film industry. And so he put together a film school, a national film studio, and then worked towards basically an initiative to create a lot of documentary type films. Okay. But part of that was appropriating an art festival that was happening in Venice at the time. So there was an art festival there, and Mussolini wanted to turn this into a film festival, a dedicated one. So his fascist helpers, they went in and took over this festival in Venice and called it the Venice International Film Festival. This is the first film festival in the world. And it's interesting because it's very tied to a fascist regime and a goal towards social control in some ways. So it runs counter to what we think of as film festivals now, but it was the beginning of the movement. And so for a while, films were coming into Venice and they would award, this is the best film of the year, a lot of different European films. And there would be a jury that would judge it on artistic merit. But in 1938, a film showed up at the festival called The Grand Illusion. And this was done by Jean Renoir. And he was a really great filmmaker that if you guys study film, you would definitely learn about him more. But The Grand Illusion itself was a film that is talking about World War I, and it has scenes of German soldiers and French soldiers getting to know each other and connecting and having empathy for each other in some ways. And so very much it is a anti-fascist film and anti-war film. And it's questioning what is the sense of this kind of fighting that we're doing. It's even questioning class systems and structures within the film. And so the jury at Venice thought the film was a masterpiece. They thought it was great. They wanted to award it the big prize. But Hitler and Mussolini, because they had the power, they said, we don't like the message of this film. We don't want it. And so they overruled the jury, and the jury moved and awarded the film called Olympia, which was basically a propaganda film. And Olympia was a documentary film that was shot at the 1936 Berlin Games in Germany. And Hitler's goal with this film, he had a director making it named Leni Riefenstahl, and his goal with it was
to glorify his race through the film. Okay. And so essentially it's a propaganda film, a pro-German film. And it won Venice, even though most of the people that went to Venice definitely knew that The Grand Illusion was a better film. And so this kind of censorship, it really irked the French, the British, and the Americans that had come. And they decided they wanted to pull out of the Venice Film Festival. And so what happened was then that France went and they created what we know today as the Cannes Film Festival. And there were two goals here. One was to have their own national film festival. Another was to have a free festival that could have the work they wanted to have without having this sort of authoritarian voice involved. And the other is that they could put it in the Riviera in a nice location where they could have people come and have a tourism come there. And so even today, Cannes is a huge premier film festival that people go to. And if you win the Palme d'Or, then it's definitely, you are a notable filmmaker in the world. Okay. But what happened was the film festival started in 1939. And then right after that, the war came. And so the war, France was taken over by Germany for a while. And so for about 5-6 years, there was no Cannes Film Festival. It ran 1 year, and then it took a pause for about 6 years, and then before it came back again. But at that point, late 40s into the 50s is when we had what kind of the birth of what we call now European art cinema. And this is a really important time in film history because what happened was you had various types of control happening in different parts of the world. So for example, the Soviet Union, artists weren't really making films in a sort of free way because they had a really strong communist regime that was pressing on them. There was also a lot of economic struggle in different parts of the world that prevented people from making art. And then in the US, we had a situation there at the time called the blacklist, where artists could not make free expression films because they might be accused of being a communist. And so they were really careful what they made, and the industry itself was making a lot of safe, popular entertainment, not looking at art that was innovative or deep in any way. And so these films were being made in Europe at the time, and you had movements like the French New Wave movement in the 50s and 60s. And you also had the neorealist movement in Italy that was looking at class issues and economy. And so all these types of films were being seen throughout Europe at these various film festivals that started coming up. And these films were then watched by people in other countries, and that influenced artists to develop their work. So in 1963, the New York Film Festival came, and this was definitely influenced by the European art cinema. And it was a way for American filmmakers to see the work from abroad. Okay. And it's interesting because while the Hollywood blacklist was happening, this sort of censorship and control on one side, you had young filmmakers attending film festivals like this and seeing really innovative work. And it gave them the motivation and inspiration to create their own art and to do it in a different way. And they ended up really transforming American film at that point. So you can see like an example, like just visually the influences. So for example, one of the films that screened at the New York Film Festival, 1964, was Woman in the Dunes, Japanese film. And it shows, you know, you can see a scene here of a woman being very passionate and very open with her sexuality, where something like that would not be seen in Hollywood at the time. And then you had this sort of kind of homage gangster type film from the French New Wave movement called Band of Outsiders. And that film, you can look at the style and the way the actors are standing and what they're wearing, and you can see how it kind of influences the film that's made in America later, Bonnie and Clyde. And Bonnie and Clyde, particularly, that bottom right film here, this is the film that really changed American cinema from that point forward, because it was a film that showed things like overt violence and sexuality, and it had a whole different innovative styles of how it told the story, the way it showed violence, the way it edited scenes together. And it was all really influenced by those French New Wave artists and other movements coming out of Europe and abroad. Okay. And then beyond that, so after New York, film festivals started to grow in the US. And at first there was just a few. And there was, so you had in North America, you had the Toronto Film Festival. That now today, Toronto is one of the main places that artists want to go to premiere their work. And then also in Utah, we had the United States Film Festival that started being formed in the 70s and then was renamed in 1989 as the Sundance Film Festival. And so today, when you think of cinema and we think of like someone premiering their film, we often think of a few festivals now. We think of the Venice Film Festival, the Cannes Film Festival, Toronto, Sundance, and Busan. Okay, and so also the Tribeca Film Festival, the New York one that Rob De Niro is in charge of. So those 5 or 6 festivals are kind of the main big places now that independent filmmakers and big studios want to premiere their work, because that's where they get a lot of critical reception and they can really highlight their film to an audience that cares about cinema. All right. In the 1990s in the US, now these film festivals were traveling all over the world in different places, but this period, particularly in the US, was kind of the high mark of the festival culture. And there's often a lot of debate about, are the festivals really independent, or are they more like big budget studio places now? But during this time, this is really when it was still kind of independent. So if you look at the upper right image, this is a film called El Mariachi. And this was directed by a filmmaker named Robert Rodriguez. And if you guys ever get a chance, there's a book called Rebel with a Crew, and it's about how he made this film. And he made it in 1991-2 period, and he made it for about $7,000 US, which at this point probably would be like maybe making it for under $20,000. So really, really a cheap film. But it ended up getting into the festival, ended up getting him a lot of acclaim as a director. It even became successful in itself and made lots of money. And it led to him being able to remake it into a big feature film. And so this was a real upstart move by this director. And this was kind of the spirit of the 90s, of these filmmakers making films for low budget that became popular, and they became popular as directors. So the generation before, they really, those are people that went to film schools and became famous after that. And this generation were the directors that just were independent and making films and getting famous from that work. So on the bottom, sorry, the top middle one, Reservoir Dogs, some of you might know this film. This is from Quentin Tarantino. And so he, from this film, became a big filmmaker. And on the upper right, you have Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which is Steven Soderbergh, who's another big filmmaker now. And so all these people started out just working in independent film and putting their work into festivals. Sorry. I'm looking for my. So the thing is with festivals, what you often see now is, for example, in Korea, we have the big Busan Film Festival, right? Well, beyond that, there's also many festivals that form. And what tends to be the case now is that if you make work and it's not being shown, it's not being seen, or maybe you're part of a group that's not being represented in some ways, more and more there's a festival that can represent you. And if there isn't, people start their own festivals. And so there's sort of an endless growth of this kind of culture in cinema. But the main thing that's kind of interesting about this is that even though the very first film festival started from a goal towards fascism and control and authoritarianism, the film festival now is a place of free expression. And even if you have these big budget ones that you can't get into, you can still get into something and get your work seen somewhere. And it allows for like a free exchange of ideas and more diverse thought in the world. So there's sort of a historical irony there. Okay. Anyway, that's the end of my talk here. So we're going to take some time to give you guys a chance to ask some questions. Okay. Because we have about 10 minutes left. And you guys can ask me anything about this or general film history or anything about our school, whatever you want to talk about. Okay. So let me open it up. And Alyssa's here also with the chat. So if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can type your question in the chat. Okay.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Professor Schwent. I really appreciate it. Can you tell us precisely which classes you are responsible for teaching here at the UAC, and what specific classes film students can expect to take?
Okay. Well, UAC, the typical push here when you guys are here at this school is that you take a lot of foundational film courses, and then when you spend that year in the main campus, that's where you take like capstone courses, really highly more advanced cinema courses. So here at the UAC, like we do introduction to film, which I teach, and we do history of film, which I also teach. But you also are taking various production courses. So you may be taking beginning film production. That Professor Alicia Clyde teaches that course, and we have new instructors coming to teach that also. You also can take specific courses with certain parts of the craft. For example, screenwriting, which is another course I teach, and directing, I teach that also. Cinematography, editing, and digital effects. And these are all courses that can help you build a strong foundation that helps you make some films before you then go to main campus to take the even more advanced, higher level stuff. Okay. We also have a lot of film studies courses. So we might, in terms of special topics like Korean cinema, women directors, and next spring I'll be teaching a course in 1980s cinema. Okay.
Great. We have a question from a current prospective student, Hyunuk. He asks, "What is your favorite movie these days, Professor Schwint?"
My favorite movie?
Yeah, these days.
These days. That's a tough one. I think my favorite movie of all time, I'm going to write the title in the chat so you guys can look it up and see it, because it's called A River Runs Through It. And that's a film directed by Robert Redford, who is involved in the Sundance Film Festival. But that's my favorite film of all time. And then I think one film I really loved in the last couple of years was Jojo Rabbit, because it looked at a really terrible time of history and found a way to show a person growing and developing empathy in some way. And I thought it was a really beautifully done film. I also am really quite interested in Jordan Peele's films like Get Out and Us. And I'm looking forward to the third one because I think he has a really unique voice and a different way of looking at things than other people. So I quite like his films. I also quite loved this last year, Minari, was really beautiful. And I've seen it twice, and it's interesting because the second time I watched it, I felt more emotional on the second watching. And I also quite liked Judas and the Black Messiah this last year. It was another film that was nominated for awards, and it was really powerful and upsetting in different ways. So
great. We do have some pretty good questions from Adut. So Adut asks, "Is film history a required film course, or is it an elective?"
It is required if you're a film major. And it's really important because you learn just the whole evolution of cinema and the foundations of visual storytelling through it. Yeah.
Great.
So
and then,
yeah, sorry, Pete.
Sorry. And then another fantastic question. Are there any opportunities for film and media arts students' work to be premiered at film festivals?
Well, that's really an opportunity you kind of have to create for yourself through the work you create, but we have a real interest in encouraging you to do that. So right now, for example, I'm teaching directing class, and I've been really pushing my students to form their work into something that can go out to festivals. And so if we see a film that's being made, if you make something that's getting to that level where we think it needs to be seen, we often will encourage you to do that. And that happens every once in a while. And also it's our other professor, Simon here, he's Simon Mekendgaard. He's really great about this because he understands a lot about the Korean film festivals. And so he can really guide you about which ones might be a strategic one to apply to based on the types of films they have there.
Great. And another question, are there lots of editing opportunities for students? Video editing
opportunities. Yes, countless editing opportunities. Because you may be editing your own work. You can jump on to projects and support other people and edit their films. We also have various offices that require video production that you may join in and be editing films for that. And yeah, there's lots of chances to be editing here. Yeah, and it's a lot of work, so you can spend a lot of time on it.
Evelyn asks, is there any movie-related knowledge that she should know prior to enrolling at the film program?
It's a really good question. I think, I don't know, I really think all of your generation, you guys have a real sophisticated visual literacy already because you've been watching media your whole life. And so the fact that you've seen all that you've seen, you're coming in with a really strong foundation of images to work from. But I think in terms of the other side of production, I would encourage you, if you haven't done it, just shoot something, like take your phone and make a film, like make sure it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, some kind of story, and just shoot it and then put it together, find some free software and edit it together and see what you make. Have a good time doing it. The more you do that, the better you're going to get at it. And often just by making repeated films, you're going to improve the craft. And so I would encourage you to maybe try that, but it's not a requirement because once you're here, you're going to be doing those types of things anyway. So just come fresh and be really open to learning the new information and do the assignments and try the activities and join on projects that are happening around campus.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. So Professor Schwint, I'm going to throw this one your way. Is the program focused only on filmmaking? How about animation? Is there animation classes available like drawing, history of making, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have really good news about animation because we have a new animation professor coming here. And so if that's your interest of being an animator, then you can definitely take those courses here and then you can expand on them at the main campus. The other thing with that is sometimes animation professors also teach storyboarding and maybe even doing things like what we call animatics. And so that's stuff that can help you as an animator support film production also. So there's lots of ways these things talk to each other. But yes, we will have courses for animation here at our campus.
Great. All right, everyone, I'm sorry that is all the time we have today for a Q&A session. I would like to thank Professor Schwint for taking this opportunity to give this sample lecture for all of these wonderful students. I would also like to remind you to please tune in to our Campus Life presentation. Information for the joining information for that presentation can be found in the chat box in this room. It's also on the agenda that we sent out yesterday.